The sky above Armageddon was no longer a sky, it was a wound that never closed. The fires that once marked victory now smoldered as relics of a forgotten triumph, painting the horizon with the color of ruin. The world that had once stood as a bastion of imperial strength now lingered in silence, hollowed by the absence of its guardian. Commissar Yarrick, the hero who had once defied the impossible and turned despair into defiance, was gone. And with his fall, something within the heart of humanity fractured. The cities of Armageddon, once alive with the sound of machinery and the march of men, were graveyards of steel. Hive Primus, the crown jewel of the planet's industry, lay in ruins, its towers snapped like bones, its streets consumed by ash. The banners of the Imperium still hung from the broken walls, fluttering weakly in the polluted winds, symbols of loyalty that had outlived those they inspired. The soldiers who remained wandered among the wreckage, not as warriors of the Emperor, but as remnants of a dream that had turned to dust. Yarrick's death had not come with glory. There had been no great explosion, no martyr's blaze, no chorus of triumph. His end had been slow, drawn out in the choking fumes of a world that refused to die. Some said he fell in battle. Others whispered that the strain of endless war had finally broken his heart. But for the men of Armageddon, the truth mattered little. What mattered was the silence he left behind, a silence heavier than any bombardment, a silence that the living could not fill. In the weeks that followed, the fabric of Imperial command began to unravel. Without Yarrick's iron will to bind them, the regiments fractured into smaller enclaves, each clinging to their own fragments of purpose. Commissars who had once served under his shadow argued among themselves over what his legacy meant. Some declared that his death was a sign to withdraw to save what remained of humanity before Armageddon became nothing but a tomb. Others believed retreat was heresy, that to abandon the planet would be to betray everything Yarrick had stood for. Between these factions, the fires of dissent began to burn. The Orcs had been pushed back after Yarrick's last campaign, but they had not been broken. The greenskin warbands, leaderless yet instinctively drawn to violence, continued to raid the outskirts of human settlements. With every attack, the defenders grew weaker, their resources stretched beyond reason. Armageddon's defenses, once fortified under Yarrick's command, now stood as hollow shells. The Prometheum fields had gone dark, and the manufactorums that once churned out tanks and munitions now served as shelters for refugees and broken soldiers. The planet that had defied extinction now seemed eager to embrace it. But even in the face of ruin, the Imperium refused to admit defeat. Messages were sent to Terra, to Segmentum Command, pleading for reinforcements. None came. The High Lords of Terra had turned their gaze elsewhere, to wars deemed more crucial, to threats closer to the golden light of the throne. Armageddon was deemed a lost world, its worth measured against the countless others burning across the galaxy. The soldiers who remained knew this truth, though none dared to speak it aloud. They fought not for the Imperium, but for survival, a survival that no longer carried purpose. In the shadow of Hive Tempestora, an army without a leader gathered. Veterans of Yarrick's last stand, scarred and hollow-eyed, patrolled the ruins. They no longer saluted the banners, nor did they chant prayers to the Emperor. Their faith had been buried alongside their commissar. They lived by inertia, not devotion, the machinery of duty, running long after its purpose had rusted away. What bound them together was not hope, but memory. The echo of a man who had once made them believe that mortals could stand against monsters. The Orcs sensed the weakness. From the wastelands beyond the dead plains, their warbands began to stir once more. Smoke rose from their camps like the breath of beasts preparing to hunt. Gazkul Thraka was gone, scattered to the void by the fury of the last war, but his legend remained. To the Orcs, Yarrick's death was not an end, but an invitation. They believed the planet was theirs again, ripe for the taking, and their war drums began to thunder once more. In the void above, Imperial ships drifted without orders, their captains hesitant to commit to battle without command from below. Some broke formation entirely, fleeing into the warp, hoping to find solace in distant systems. Others chose to stay, orbiting the dying world like vultures circling a carcass. The astropaths' cries for aid echoed into silence, their voices swallowed by the endless noise of a galaxy consumed by war. Armageddon was alone. Among the ruins, a new figure began to emerge. Not a leader, nor a hero, but a shadow, an echo of what once was. He bore no name, no insignia of rank. He was just another soldier who had survived too long. Yet those who saw him claimed he fought with a ferocity that defied reason, his movements echoing those of the fallen commissar. Some began to whisper that Yarrick had not truly died, that the Emperor had willed his spirit to fight on through another vessel. The rumor spread like fire among the broken regiments, igniting something dangerous. Hope. The man himself said nothing. He did not command, did not lead. He simply fought in the trenches, among the ruins, wherever the orcs pressed hardest. And wherever he fought, men followed, not out of loyalty, but instinct, the same instinct that had once driven them to follow Yarrick into the jaws of hell. In a world where faith had turned to ash, this nameless warrior became the ember that refused to die. In time, the fragmented forces of the Imperium began to rally once more. Under his silent presence, the scattered enclaves united. Old banners were raised again, tattered but unbroken. The name Yarrick was whispered in reverence, not as a memory, but as a promise. Armageddon would not fall. Not yet. Above the world, the storm clouds gathered once more. The void shimmered with green light as orc vessels began to breach orbit. The war that had never truly ended was about to begin again. And in the heart of the desolation, the nameless warrior stood, his face obscured by the smoke and the fire, his shadow long across the broken earth. Some called him a ghost, others called him a curse. But for those who still remembered what it meant to fight for humanity, he was something far greater. He was the echo of faith, the last spark of defiance in a universe that had forgotten how to hope. There was no dawn on Armageddon anymore. The sun rose behind clouds of ash and war smoke, its light smothered before it reached the ground. The planet existed in a state between life and death, breathing, but never alive. The imperial calendar continued to mark the passage of days, but to those who still fought, time had lost all meaning. The war never ended. It merely shifted, reshaped itself into new horrors with every sunrise. After Yarrick's fall, the Imperium's structure began to decay. Armageddon's planetary command had collapsed, its chain of authority reduced to fragments of broken hierarchy. The Astra Militarum regiments that remained became isolated warlords of ruin, each fighting their own battles, each declaring themselves the last line of defense. The Vox channels that once carried Yarrick's orders were now filled with static, desperate pleas and the sounds of dying men. Coordination was gone, replaced by instinct, the raw drive to survive for one more hour. In Hive Tempestora, the remnants of the Steel Legion held their ground amid the ruins. They were no longer an army, but a gathering of ghosts wearing uniforms. The manufactorums around them had fallen silent, their machines dead, their workers gone. Entire districts were left uninhabited, stripped bare of anything useful. What was left of the once proud Hive was a carcass, its skeletal structures crumbling under the weight of centuries of war. Yet in those ruins, the Imperium still clung to life, however faintly. General Terova, once one of Yarrick's sub-commanders, had assumed reluctant leadership of the fragmented defense. His command post was a half-destroyed chapel, its stained glass shattered, its altar now a map table. The walls bore the marks of lasfire and blood. Around him, the officers of the remaining regiments argued in hushed voices, their faces lit by the glow of tactical displays that meant little without reinforcements. Terova spoke rarely. His eyes, hollow and sunken, carried the same exhaustion seen in every soldier who had outlived his purpose. The nameless warrior had become a myth among the ranks. Rumors of his presence spread through the trenches and shattered strongholds, stories whispered in the dark to keep fear at bay. Some claimed he was a revenant of Yarrick himself, his soul returned to lead the Imperium once more. Others said he was a creation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a machine given form and fury to replace the man the Emperor had taken. None knew the truth, and none dared to ask. Faith, even if built on falsehood, was better than despair. The war continued without end. The orcs attacked in waves, undisciplined, chaotic, yet endless. They came from the dead plains, from the toxic wastes, from the shattered manufactorums, drawn by the scent of battle. Every engagement was a massacre. For every orc that fell, 10 more appeared. And yet, somehow, the Imperium endured. Their weapons were old, their ammunition scarce, their morale stretched thin, but the will to fight that stubborn, impossible spark refused to die. The Adeptus Mechanicus worked tirelessly in the shadows of the ruins, salvaging technology from the wreckage of fallen titans and broken tanks. They rebuilt what they could, reforged steel into crude weapons, and used ancient data drives to activate forgotten defense systems. Their prayers to the Omnissiah echoed through the hollow chambers of their forges, metallic hymns sung to machines that no longer answered. But still they worked. Still they believed that steel and prayer could hold back the end. The ecclesiarchy declared Yarrick a saint. His death had been transformed into a symbol, his name used to summon faith from ashes. Pilgrims came from the outer hives, seeking relics of the fallen hero. They carried fragments of his armor, spent bullet casings from his campaigns, or the rusted chainsword teeth said to have belonged to his blade. Shrines were built in the ruins, lit by the flickering light of dying candles. Men prayed not to the emperor, but to Yarrick, to the man who had once proven that a mortal could stand against monsters. The cult of the Steel Saint was born, and with it came both unity and division. The High Lords of Terror took notice. Messages arrived through the warp, bearing the seal of the Inquisition. They spoke of heresy, of idolatry unbecoming of the Emperor's servants. But no one on Armageddon listened. They had been abandoned too long to care about doctrine. The Emperor's light had not reached them in years. Yarrick's faith was the only one that still burned. It was said that in the depths of Hive Acheron, beneath kilometers of ruin and decay, a new forge had been built, not by the Mechanicus, but by the faithful. Soldiers, priests, and refugees labored side by side to construct something monumental. A fortress, cathedral carved from the bones of tanks and the wreckage of war machines. Upon its highest spire hung Yarrick's banner, tattered but unbroken. It was not a symbol of victory, but of endurance, of the refusal to surrender, even when there was nothing left to fight for. Yet endurance had its price. Supplies dwindled, starvation spread, and disease crept through the camps like an unseen enemy. The orcs, though fewer in number after their last defeat, adapted to the new reality. They began to dig, constructing tunnels beneath the hives, striking from below like vermin. Entire regiments vanished overnight, swallowed by the earth. The Imperium responded with fire and fury, collapsing entire city blocks to root out the invaders. But the damage was done. Each victory cost them more than they could afford to lose. Amid the chaos, the nameless warrior reappeared. He was seen walking through the ruins of Hive Tempestora, his armor covered in ash, his blade stained with blood, both human and orc. He spoke to no one. "I gave no orders." But wherever he went, the orcs fell. Some claimed to have seen his face scarred, aged, and unmistakably human. Others swore that his eyes burned with light, as though something divine had taken root within him. To the soldiers, it no longer mattered who he was. He was the reminder that not all heroes needed names. Weeks turned to months. The war became a ritual attack, retreat, rebuild, repeat. The cycle continued until even the concept of victory lost its meaning. Armageddon had become a monument to endurance itself. Those who still lived had stopped asking when it would end. The only question that remained was how long they could last before the planet finally devoured them all. And yet, in that desolation, something began to shift. Reports came from the outer wastelands, reports of orc warbands turning on one another, their leaders tearing each other apart in frenzied bloodshed. Others spoke of storms in the warp, disrupting orc reinforcements from beyond the system. Some claimed to have seen Imperial ships returning to orbit, their lights like distant stars in the darkness. Hope, fragile and dangerous, began to creep back into the hearts of the living. No one knew what had caused it. Some said it was divine intervention. Others whispered that the nameless warrior had done the impossible, that he had struck deep into the orc strongholds and killed their warlord in single combat. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was that for the first time since Yarrick's death, the soldiers of Armageddon began to believe again. But faith, once awakened, was not easily contained. And as the Imperial banners rose once more over the ruins of Hive Primus, the galaxy beyond stirred, watching, waiting, and remembering that the fires of Armageddon never truly die. Armageddon had forgotten what peace looked like. The sky was a cauldron of fire and ash, its storms carrying the metallic taste of death. The air was thick with the residue of endless bombardment, a haze through which no sunlight could pierce. The land itself had become a graveyard of empires, where the bones of tanks and soldiers lay intertwined, indistinguishable from one another. Yet amid the ruin, something began to stir, a call not of despair, but of purpose, a whisper that spread like wildfire through the fractured remnants of humanity. It began as a rumor. Soldiers in the lower hives spoke of lights appearing above the ruins of the Basilica of Steel, spectral shapes that walked among the broken altars, whispering the words, "He still watches." No one could say where the rumor started, but within weeks it had reached every regiment still fighting. The faithful called it a sign, the hardened called it madness, but in the wasteland of faith that Armageddon had become, even madness was better than silence. Commissar Yarrick's banner, thought lost after his final battle, was found buried beneath the rubble of Hive Mortis. It was torn, burned, but unmistakable. The symbol of the Aquila and the iron skull still gleamed faintly beneath the soot. Soldiers knelt before it, some in prayer, others in shame. They did not know who had unearthed it, only that it appeared as if by divine will. The relic became the spark. From the ashes of despair rose a movement, one that would become known as the Last Crusade of Armageddon. The nameless warrior became its heart. He did not claim leadership, nor did he speak of destiny. He simply appeared where he was needed most, standing in silence among the soldiers, his armor scarred, his eyes burning with the same resolve Yarrick once carried. Wherever he stood, the broken lines of the Imperium held. Wherever he walked, men followed. His silence became command, his presence, faith. The first of the Crusade's banners was raised in the ruins of Hive Tempestora. Thousands gathered, guardsmen, priests, refugees, and the half-broken remains of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They came not because of orders, but because something deep within their souls refused to let the planet die. The cult of the Steel Saint declared that Yarrick's spirit had returned to guide them, not as flesh, but as purpose. Sermons echoed through the Hive's hollow halls, speaking of sacrifice, of redemption through endurance. The words of the priests mixed with the thunder of marching boots, and once again, Armageddon trembled with the rhythm of war. The Adeptus Mechanicus reactivated the forges, reforging scrap metal into weapons, reawakening the old titans buried beneath the surface. The priests anointed the machines with sacred oils, reciting litanies over engines that groaned like dying gods. Even the aged basilisks and lemon rust tanks were reborn, their hulls etched with inscriptions, "He watches, we endure." The forges roared to life, not through faith in technology, but through faith in Yarrick the Saint, who had become the machine's soul. In the cold void above the planet, Imperial vessels that had long abandoned their posts began to return. The Crusade's message had reached them through the warp, carried by voices that could not possibly exist. Some captains claimed to have seen visions Yarrick himself, standing upon the deck of their ships, his bionic arm raised, commanding them to return. Others heard only static, but felt an unshakable compulsion to descend once more into the war they had fled. Soon, the skies of Armageddon filled with Imperial gunships, their engines howling like angels of vengeance. The orcs, ever drawn to conflict, responded in kind. Across the wastelands, their tribes rallied. New warlords rose from the ashes of the old, their ranks swollen by endless numbers. Green tides poured from the Deathlands, their cries shaking the ruined hives. The sky was split by the fire of anti-air batteries and the descent of Orc Rock's crude meteors filled with berserk warriors eager for slaughter. For every Orc that fell, 2 more took its place. The world shuddered under the weight of war reborn. But this time, humanity did not break. The crusade was not born of command or structure, it was born of belief. There were no ranks, no hierarchy. Each soldier fought as part of a single burning will. Across the hives, makeshift banners bearing Yarrick's emblem flew from towers, tanks, and the very corpses of fallen enemies. The air thundered with chants that shook the walls. He watches, he endures, we fight. In Hive Primus, the largest of the surviving bastions, the final plan took form. The cult of the Steel Saint declared that Armageddon would not merely defend itself, it would purge the planet of the Orc plague once and for all. The Crusade's leaders, among them General Tarova and the high priests of the Mechanicus, gathered in the remnants of the old command center, where Yarrick himself had once stood. There, under the cracked emblem of the Aquila, they swore their oaths. The war would end here, not with retreat, not with surrender, but with fire. The assault began on the 30th day of the 49th year after Yarrick's fall. The Imperium's forces surged across the wastelands, their formations a mosaic of broken regiments, improvised machines, and ancient titans awakened from slumber. The ground trembled beneath their advance. Orc warbands clashed with them in a storm of violence that tore the land apart. The crusade pressed on, unstoppable, fueled not by hope of survival, but by devotion to a memory that had become more powerful than any living man. The nameless warrior led the vanguard. He wielded a blade forged from Yarrick's shattered bionic arm, reforged by the Mechanicus as a relic of faith and fury. He cut through the Orc lines like a storm, his presence a living embodiment of the Emperor's will. Soldiers followed him through fire and ruin, their cries rising above the chaos. For Yarrick, for the Emperor, for humanity. The final battle raged for 3 days and nights. The wastelands became oceans of flame. Titans fell like mountains, their reactors bursting into suns of annihilation. Orc warlords fought to the last breath, bellowing defiance even as the Imperium's guns tore them apart. The planet itself seemed to cry out, its surface cracked, its atmosphere burning, its oceans boiling. But the crusade did not falter. When the smoke cleared, there was no victory, only silence. The Orc hordes had been shattered, their war engines reduced to slag. The survivors of the crusade stood among the ruins, their numbers few, their bodies broken, but their eyes alight with something the Orcs could never kill: resolve. In the heart of the battlefield, the nameless warrior stood over a mound of Orc corpses. His armor was torn, his flesh burned, but his stance unyielding. He looked toward the horizon, where dawn struggled to break through the clouds, and raised his blade one last time. No one ever saw him again. Some said he ascended into the light, others believed he fell where he stood, his body lost among the countless dead. But every soldier who survived swore they heard his voice carried on the wind, not words, but a feeling, a reminder that Yarrick's faith had never died, and never would. The war for Armageddon had not ended, it never would. But for the first time in generations, humanity had remembered what it meant to fight, not for survival, but for belief. The war had ended, but Armageddon did not know peace. The planet was a wound that would never heal, its surface blackened by fire, its skies still trembling from the echoes of the final bombardments. The oceans boiled with toxins, the air burned with radiation and ash, yet humanity remained. Amid ruins that stretched from horizon to horizon, survivors gathered, not as soldiers or refugees, but as pilgrims. They came from every hive, every shattered regiment, every forgotten corner of the Imperium. They came to remember. In the heart of the wasteland, where the crusade had made its final stand, the earth had fused into glass. The battlefield stretched for miles, a field of melted armor and fossilized corpses, each frozen mid-charge, immortalized in death. There, upon a blackened hill of steel and bone, they built a shrine. It began as a single statue, forged from the remnants of Yarrick's banner pole, his broken bolt pistol, and the fragments of the nameless warrior's armor. The artisans of the Mechanicus worked in silence, guided not by schematics but by faith. The result was neither a likeness of Yarrick nor the unknown champion who carried his flame, but a fusion of both, a symbol of endurance incarnate. They called it the Iron Saint. The statue's face was half human, half machine, the dual nature of sacrifice and will. One eye was the mechanical lens of Yarrick's bionic implant, unblinking and cold. The other was human, carved with the expression of eternal defiance. The blade in its hand, reforged from the relic of the Last Crusade, pointed not upward toward the heavens, but downward into the soil of Armageddon, a promise that the world would never again fall without a fight. The shrine grew into a city. Around the Iron Saint, cathedrals of metal and stone rose from the ruins, built by hands still trembling from war. The Mechanicus called it a miracle, the machines responding to prayer rather than command. For the first time since the Great Crusade, faith itself seemed to power industry. The forges glowed once more, fueled by chance instead of plasma. Even the Titans, their reactors long extinguished, stood as monuments of faith, their hollow chassis echoing with the hymns of the devoted. And so began the cult Mechanicus Sanctum Yarrica, the fusion of machine and spirit. Its priests did not worship technology as divinity alone, but as the vessel through which humanity's faith found form. Yarrick's teachings, once words of steel and discipline, became scripture. Endurance is duty. Duty is survival. Survival is faith. These words were engraved upon every wall, every weapon, every heart that still beat in Armageddon's cursed air. The Imperium took notice. In the decades that followed, Imperial reinforcements finally returned, battle fleets, inquisitors, and ecclesiarchs. They came not to rescue, but to reclaim. What they found was a world reborn in paradox, half holy world, half factory. The Inquisition saw heresy, the ecclesiarchy saw a rival, the Mechanicus saw evolution, but no one could deny the result. Armageddon stood. The planet that should have died 100 times remained unbroken. Its people were no longer mere soldiers, they were disciples of endurance, their very blood sanctified by Yarrick's will. The High Lords of Terror debated how to define this anomaly. Some called it a beacon of faith, others a heretical cult born of desperation. But when they sent their emissaries to dismantle the shrine, their ships never arrived. Warp storms surrounded Armageddon, isolating it once again from the stars. The priests of the Iron Saint claimed it was divine protection. The Inquisition called it containment. Either way, the message was clear. The world of Yarrick belonged to itself. Generation passed. Children born beneath the shadow of the Iron Saint grew up reciting his creed as naturally as breathing. The concept of fear became alien to them. When orc spores resurfaced in the wastelands, they did not flee. They marched. Their rifles were relics, their tanks rusted beyond repair, but their hearts burned like the engines of gods. They fought not for glory, nor even for the Emperor, but for the idea that Yarrick's will was immortal, and in that belief, they were unstoppable. In time, pilgrims began to arrive from across the Imperium. They came in silence, crossing sectors ravaged by chaos and void. They came to see the world that had defied the end. They came to touch the glass fields where the final battle had burned the planet into memory. They knelt before the Iron Saint, whispering prayers for courage, for clarity, for endurance. Many claimed they could hear a heartbeat beneath the statue's iron chest, a pulse that matched their own. Scholars of the Ordo Hereticus argued endlessly over the phenomenon. Some said the Iron Saint was alive, that the fusion of relics and faith had created a warp entity, neither daemon nor saint, but something new, a god born not of chaos, but of defiance. Others warned that such power was perilous, that the faith of mortals could birth divinity as easily as damnation. The Adeptus Mechanicus dismissed the debate. For them, faith and machine were now one. Yet the truth remained buried beneath the sands of Armageddon, known only to those who dared to descend beneath the shrine's foundations. Deep below the Iron Saint, sealed behind wards of adamantium and holy sigils, rested a sarcophagus, ancient, silent, and unmarked. its sensors long deactivated, its systems dormant. But within, preserved by the Mechanicus and protected by secrecy, lay the remains of the nameless warrior. His body, broken beyond recognition, still clutched the reforged blade. The symbol of Yarrick's bionic arm gleamed faintly upon his chestplate. His face was obscured, not by death, but by design, for in him, faith had become form. No one dared to open the tomb. Some said to disturb it would be to invite the wrath of the saint. Others claimed that the figure inside was not human at all, that the fusion of faith and warp had transformed him into something else entirely. The priests called him the vessel, the living embodiment of the Emperor's enduring will. To the faithful, he was proof that even mortality could be transcended through devotion. As centuries passed, the legend of the Iron Saint spread beyond Armageddon. His cults appeared on distant worlds, whispering his name in secret prayers during sieges and crusades. In the dark corners of the Imperium, where hope was a dangerous luxury, soldiers would carve his sigil into their armor, a stylized skull of iron pierced by a downward blade. To wear it was to invoke his endurance. To die with it was to ascend with his memory. And so, long after the death of Yarrick and the fall of his flesh, his spirit endured not as a ghost or god, but as an idea, a force that no warp storm, no Xenos, no daemon could erase. The Iron Saint had become more than legend, he had become inevitability. In the 43rd millennium, when the Orcs returned once more to Armageddon, drawn by ancient echoes of war, they found a world waiting silent, cold, and unyielding. The Iron Saint still stood at the heart of the planet, his blade buried deep in the scorched ground. The pilgrims did not scream when the greenskin hordes descended upon them. They simply raised their weapons and prayed. And as the first shots rang out, the air itself seemed to hum with power. Some swore they saw the statue move, its eyes glowing with an iron light. Others heard a voice, not a command, not a plea, but a single word that carried across the burning plains. In the endless dark between the stars, faith travels faster than light. Long after Armageddon's sky turned to rust, and the dust of its wars settled into the bones of the planet, the legend of Yarrick did not fade. It spread not as record or report, but as resonance. Like the hum of distant engines, it vibrated through the void, carried by the whispers of pilgrims, the prayers of dying soldiers, the static of imperial vox networks. Across millennia, it became less a story and more a presence, invisible, indestructible, eternal. The Imperium of man had changed. The galaxy no longer belonged to humanity alone. Chaos storms carved bleeding scars across entire sectors, and the Astronomican's light flickered like a dying star. Whole subsectors vanished into shadow, devoured by orc empires, tyrannid swarms, or silence itself. The Administratum could no longer count its worlds. The ecclesiarchy no longer knew its flock. In that age of unreason, even the Emperor's name was a whisper, but Yarrick's remained a roar. They called it the Iron Faith. It began quietly, as all revolutions of belief do. Small garrisons along the eastern fringe began marking their helmets with the downward blade of the Iron Saint. Regiment logs showed unusual behavioral patterns. Soldiers holding their ground even after command collapse, civilians refusing evacuation, engineers refusing to abandon their posts even as reactors went critical. Reports labeled it as fanatic morale. The Inquisition called it dangerous, but the truth was simpler. They had remembered what it meant to endure. In the void above the dead world of Cyrene, a fleet of refugee vessels held formation around a derelict battlecruiser. Its name was the Yarrick's Oath. No one knew who had named it. No one claimed command. Yet every ship moved in unison, every weapon fired in rhythm, every pilot acted as if guided by unseen hand. Vox channels, thick with static, carried a single coded signal repeating endlessly, "He endures, so shall we." The fleet repelled 3 separate raids from Chaos Corsairs before vanishing into the warp, its fate unknown, its legend inevitable. On the forge world of Acheron Primus, where faith and steel had always intertwined, the tech priests of the Sanctum Yarrica completed what they called the Iron Synod. It was a machine prayer, a union of mind and mechanism meant to project Yarrick's will into the warp itself, not as a psychic beacon, but as a concept, a weaponized creed. When the Synod was activated, astropaths across 5 sectors screamed in unison. Ships lost in the warp suddenly stabilized, their Geller fields burning with faint iron light. For 72 hours, chaos activity in that region ceased. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the phenomenon vanished, leaving only silence and a faint metallic echo that lingered in every Vox channel, a single heartbeat, steady and unbreakable. The ecclesiarchy could not ignore it. They tried to claim Yarrick as one of their own, canonizing him as Saint Sebastian Yarrick, defender of the unyielding faith. Cathedrals were raised in his name across hundreds of worlds, some sanctioned, others built in secret. In each, his effigy appeared different, a commissar in some, a machine, God in others, and in a few a faceless figure of iron holding a blade that pierced the earth. To the Imperium, he was many things: saint, heretic, martyr, myth. But to those who fought in the mud, who died nameless under the banners of forgotten regiments, he was simply hope. In the underhives of Necromunda, gangs once devoted to blood and chaos now painted the symbol of the Iron Saint upon their walls, believing it warded off mutation. In the void cities of the Segmentum Pacificus, miners would touch their augmetic limbs before a shift, whispering, "Yarrick watches." Even in the darkest reaches of the Eastern Fringe, far from the Emperor's light, warlords spoke his name before battle, not in reverence, but in fear. For wherever the Iron Faith spread, resistance followed. 1,000 years after the last crusade of Armageddon, the Orcs returned to that cursed world once again. They found not ruins, but fortresses, not despair, but preparation. The pilgrims who had once knelt before the Iron Saint now stood as warriors clad in relic armor, their bodies augmented with crude but sacred machines. Their voices carried across the plains in hymns older than any living soul. When the Orcs charged, the ground itself seemed to answer seismic tremors from titans reawakened beneath the surface, their machine spirits stirred by faith alone. The battle that followed was not war, it was ritual. The green tide broke against a wall of belief, and for the first time in history, it did not return. Word of this miracle reached the Segmentum Solar through fragmented transmissions. Entire fleets altered course, following the signal of the Iron Saint's creed. The Adeptus Astartes of 3 chapters declared crusade, not by order of the High Lords, but by conviction. They landed upon Armageddon's surface, knelt before the statue, and left their banners in the soil. When they rose, their oaths were bound not by command, but by reverence. Even the Inquisition, fractured and suspicious, could not deny the phenomenon. In the black ships of terror, interrogators whispered of a faith that resists the warp. Some claimed to have seen Yarrick's shadow within the Emperor's own throne room, not as a ghost, but as memory given form. An idea so powerful that even the Golden Throne could not ignore it. And so the legend passed beyond the stars. In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, where the Astronomican's light could no longer be seen, a lone Imperial frigate drifted through the void. Its engines were silent, its crew long dead, but inside its chapel, a single lumen still burned. Before it stood, a rusted figure of iron, its surface cracked, its face obscured. The last words etched upon the altar were ancient and simple. He was mortal, he was flesh, he endured. And in his endurance, we were remade. When the ship finally entered the gravity well of an unknown system, its hull broke apart, scattering relics across a barren world. Centuries later, explorers would find those fragments and kneel before them, not knowing their origin, only feeling the echo that clung to them, the pulse of defiance, the iron heartbeat of belief. And so it was that Yarrick's death became not an ending, but a beginning. His life was the story of one man's defiance, his legacy, the awakening of an empire's soul. As the 44th millennium dawned and the galaxy drowned in war, the Emperor's light flickered, but the Iron Saint's flame did not. In the warp, where gods of madness writhed and whispered, A new presence stirred, neither daemon nor divine. It stood at the edge of reality, half man, half memory, watching the stars burn. And though it spoke no words, its very being carried a message that every soul, from terror to the void, could feel within the marrow of their bones. Endurance is not survival. Endurance is victory.